Hello, everybody. It is I, the Desert Viking. And today we are going to be going over part one of a two-part lecture that I gave in Lodge recently. And it's two parts because it took me about 45 minutes to get through this in Lodge, and that was rushed. So now I have the opportunity to do this a little bit more slower and add a few more things to it. So as such, I think it would be too long to do it as one giant video. So we're going to do it in two parts. So today, as the slide entails, we're going to be discussing the Qabalah and the history of Western Hermetic Esotericism. And we're going to be discussing these things from the lens of Freemasonry, as I did this in a Freemasonic lodge. But this talk is aimed at anyone who's interested in Qabalah or the history of Western Hermetic Esotericism. The focal point of this this lecture was for people who have very little exposure to what these things are and want to know where to begin. That was the point of doing this. And I have covered these topics on my channel before, but there are a lot of videos, so this kind of compiles those into a more updated version, at least for now, until I have to do it again, right? I am interested in beginning to do a Qabalah workshop in the near future. That's kind of on my plate to do. But what we're going to be discussing today is kind of Qabalah and then how it fits in the history of our human timeline. And so we actually begin with the history of Western Hermetic Esotericism, because otherwise there's no real context. And for me, that kind of kills things if I don't know where things fit in. Immediately in the lecture, I got a question: what is Hermeticism? And we will talk about what Hermeticism is in a moment. Another thing that I would like to bring to heart is that while I gave this lecture in a Freemason's lodge, and this channel is about esoteric Freemasonry, Hermeticism is not Freemasonry. Okay, those are two separate things. As you're going to see, esotericism isn't just one thing. It's a great many things, and Freemasonry is its own thing. Though Freemasonry does share Hermetic symbols with Hermetic esotericism. They share symbols. But the relationship I like to liken them to is more American football and rugby. Those are both sports, and those both involve a ball, and those both involve a lot of violence on the field. But that's about where their similarity ends. And so that's how I kind of liken Freemasonry with Western Hermetic Esotericism. They share some things in common. And before we start, the first thing I like to go over is, what does esoteric mean? Because they use that word a lot. Esoteric and exoteric are two terms that are opposites of each other. And exoteric is knowledge known to the general public, and you take it usually at its literal meaning. Esoteric is intended for, likely understood only by a small number of people with a specialized knowledge or interest. Okay, so when we say esoteric, we're talking about specialized knowledge, or we're talking about deeper knowledge that most people really wouldn't care about or understand or need in their lives for them. And the example I will give, religion. Because Hermeticism and Freemasonry both delve into the realm of the spiritual, religion is an appropriate comparison tool. And so here I have what I call the orb of woo-woo, broken into the major religions of the world. And if you'll note, all of the religions in the world have an exoteric crust. This is where most people belong to. And then in that, you have the inner mysteries or the esoteric knowledge. and then inner to that is the core, which is the quote-unquote truth. And if you notice, they're all part of the same orb. That one's important. Qabalah is considered a branch of Jewish mysticism, though it does also exist as Christian mysticism. It was made a part of Christian mysticism during the Renaissance and 1700s, where it was converted over to the Christian symbology. So it can be both. Gnosticism is another example of the esoteric side of Christianity. There's a great many other examples that are given in that slide. As an example of exoteric, a passage in Scripture. In Scripture, Jesus was said to have literally walked on water. So to the exoteric, that means he literally walked on water. There was an event where he did that thing. He supernaturally walked on water. The esoteric will take that and try to break that down into its allegory. What's it really trying to convey to us? And one of the things that it can convey to us is if you break down the symbols in that story, water is an element. It's one of the major elements, the four major elements, and that typically represents our emotional state. And to walk on water is to show that you have controlled your emotions. You have controlled your emotions so well that you can walk on the water. And Peter's amazed. And Christ says to him, you can walk on the water too. This isn't just reserved for him. This isn't just reserved for Jesus. You can walk on water too. All people can walk on water. You just have to control your emotions. And Peter gets out of the boat and he walks on water. He's amazed. And then it gets stormy and the winds whip up and the waves start getting nasty and Peter gets afraid. Once that fear claws in his heart, what happens? He sinks beneath the waves and he's drowning. And Christ reaches down into the water. And he pulls him up and says, why were you afraid? I told you could walk on water. And that allegory, that passage in Scripture tells us that it's easy to control your emotions when there's no challenges going on in life. It's much more difficult to control your emotions when fear and hatred and all of those nasty storms are going on in our life. So that's the difference between an exoteric view of that passage and an esoteric view of that passage. Now we get into Western Hermeticism. I said we talk. One of the questions I got early on was, what is Western Hermeticism? Hermeticism itself stems from the writings, the alleged writings of Hermes Trismegistus. Now, Hermes Trismegistus was considered to be a contemporary of Moses or before Moses. In fact, in some traditions, to include Hermeticism, Hermes is the equivalent of Enoch and Thoth from the Egyptians. And this was widely believed throughout the known world for a long, long time. And this is one of the reasons why Hermeticism was allowed by the church to continue for as long as it did, because the early forefathers of the Orthodox Roman Church, before it became what it was, respected Hermeticism. Unfortunately, during the Renaissance revival of the 1600s, we determined that the Hermetic writings, at least the ones we had, were not ancient at all. They were, in fact, just Greek writings from the Apostolic era or thereabouts. And they determined that based off the language that was used. The language that was being used was filled with Greek euphemisms and sayings and things of that sort, where the words and whatnot wouldn't have been used if they had been written in Egyptian times. There's very little Egyptian in the supposed Egyptian writings of Hermes Trismegistus. So it was determined that the Hermetic writings came from much later in the Apostolic era, and they were influenced by the Gnostics and the Neoplatonists. And thus, Hermeticism lost its sparkle in the Renaissance and kind of quickly died down. It does not remove its importance, but that places of where what it is and what era it came about in. Now, the goal of Western Hermeticism, why we do what we do, is it's a framework for understanding the relationship between the divine, the cosmos, and ourselves. This allows us to achieve a spiritual enlightenment and a form of gnosis by which we may reunify with the divine. It is a form of our nirvana. It is the Western version of nirvana, where we achieve inner peace and fulfillment. Hermeticism is based on a lot of Gnostic tradition. And a lot of Gnostic tradition is based off of Platonic writings at its root, from the Timaeus and other works of Plato. And then it is fleshed out by other mid-Platonic and Neoplatonic authors over the course of several centuries. One of the core tenets of Gnosticism, which existed before Jesus was born. Jesus likely studied some forms of Gnosticism because, for example, the Book of Enoch, which isn't technically a Gnostic writing, but that was written about 100 years before Christ was born. Well, some of the Gnostic texts themselves, or the Timaeus, those were there. So Christ knew about these things. And a lot of his sayings in the canonical scriptures reflect a Gnostic tone. But ultimately, Gnostics believe that you don't need a church to achieve a union with God. You just need to realize that the kingdom of heaven lies within you and that we are all shards of the divine. Gnostics believe that we are all pieces of God experiencing things, which is kind of what the Qabalah is also all about. And the thing with Hermeticism, the thing with understanding that all humans are equal, because we are all shards of the divine, is that we have to get rid of the crazy notion of castes and ranks. And this is very difficult for most people to do. Most people are very tied up in their status and their titles and how useful they are. So, for example, I had one of my brothers was saying, yes, all men are equal, but Pythagoras outranks him because Pythagoras did so much more. So those are traps that we can fall into. Because why that's bad is, yes, it's good to be humble and realize that other people have done a lot for us, and that in itself is good. But what it also keeps in your mind is that there's a ranking system, and that someday when you've done enough things, you're going to feel that you're more useful than other people. You outrank those people, and that's where the dark side can come in. That is the opposite of what we're trying to achieve. That means you're not equal. If you can't say we're all equal, but he's more equal, that is a human condition, and you have to shed that, and that's hard to do. And last, we're trying to transcend the illusion of the material world and realize there's more to life, there's more to existence than the stuff that we see around us today. But at the same time, we are both the material and the spiritual, and we have to strike a balance between those two things. We cannot just be all material or all spiritual. Rudolf Steiner talks about that, and he has applied two nefarious individuals to either end of those spectrums. He has applied Ahriman, the Persian demon, to ultra-materialism, and he has applied Lucifer to the ultra-spiritual. And extremes of those are bad. You want to try to find that middle ground. So that is our goal in Hermeticism, to achieve that unity. And that is different. So Freemasonry, we're taught about morals and virtues and contributing to your community and being useful and keeping your emotions in check, which ties into Hermeticism, and sharpening your mind through diligent study and not being afraid to die for what you believe in and not being afraid of death in general, because this is not the only life that we have. This is not the only existence that we have. Those two things, again, they're very different from each other. They share some things in common, but they're different. Now, we're going to go into some history. And before we start that, I have another slide that is important. Everything we're going to talk about today stems from an oral tradition. And that oral tradition, as its name implies, was not written down. Almost nothing was written down concerning the mystery traditions. Everything was passed down from priest to priest, mouth to ear. So there is no written evidence until about the 1400s or so. And so scholastically, academics, and let me be clear, I am an engineer by trade. I'm deeply rooted in science. Science is important, but science has flaws. It wasn't too long ago that people were being laughed at, imprisoned, and put to death for believing that the earth revolved around the sun. It wasn't that long ago that Paracelsus suggested that people were getting sick, not because of bad blood or anything, but because there were little creatures, microscopic creatures, little demons that would get into our bodies and make us sick. And he was laughed at and called a kook for that. Of course, we now know today that those are called viruses and bacteria. Science knows what it knows, and the scientific method is useful, but has flaws. We rely on an arrogance that we think we know everything. We rely on 5 very flawed senses that are flawed because we couldn't comprehend reality as it really was. And just some basic examples. There are colors we know exist that we cannot see. There are sounds we cannot hear. There are rays that we cannot fathom, like X-rays and gamma rays. We can't see those things, but we know they exist. Science is now teaching through physics that there are dimensions around us that we don't understand, but they overlap us. So a lot of the spiritual traditions are coming back to be reunified through our science. Another flaw of science or academia is that if there is no written evidence, to them it never happened. And they're very stubborn, even when they don't even acknowledge that other things could exist. So as an example, the Sphinx. They say the Sphinx has water damage on it. And geologists say, yes, there's water damage. Now, I'm not a geologist, and I have not been to the Sphinx. So I have to trust what I'm hearing, yes. But from the pictures I have seen and the geologists who have reported on it, they are 100% that that's water damage. Well, water damage couldn't have happened to the Sphinx in the time that they say, academics say, that it was built. So to me, it's not kooky to say that the Sphinx is older than what science tells us it is. Another one. Again, if there's no written evidence, it doesn't exist. This is why you'll never find the origins of Freemasonry, the true origins, because the true origins were not written down. No one wrote a book and said, today I am starting Freemasonry on this date. We'll talk about this with the Qabalah as well, because the Qabalah, they don't know how old it is. They'll tell you it's from, the earliest would be the beginning of the apostolic era, when tradition tells us it was started by Moses, mouth to ear. And there's no way to prove that because Moses didn't write it down. But let's say we're in a room. This is how I rationalize this anyway. We're in a room. There's 100 of us in the room, and I give you a secret tradition. I say, this is our tradition from now on going forth. All 100 of you know this tradition. And here's the rule. You're not allowed to you're not allowed to write it down. You can only pass it mouth to ear. You can only tell someone about it. And let's say 500 years pass. And everyone has followed the rules. No one has written anything down for 500 years. And then Bob writes it down. Bob says, I'm going to write this mystery down. There it is. And then some time passes, and scholars go, when did that tradition begin? Well, it began with Bob's writing. So that's the date that they'll put it began with Bob's writing here. And if you try to say, no, it existed 500 years before that, you'll be called pseudoscience because there's no evidence to back that up. Now, we all know it started 500 years before Bob wrote it down, but science will not acknowledge that because there's no written evidence. And so that's another flaw when we're dealing with oral traditions that you have to keep in mind. And so when I'm talking about stuff like this, I have what's called Rule Zero, which is I understand that you cannot back this up with scholarly evidence. This is legend and lore and tradition. It is up to you to determine how you wish to view that information. I also refer to this as trust me, bro. Trust me, bro is I cannot prove this. You just have to trust me. Now, there are various forms of trust me, bro. The one I struggle with most is channeling my information, meaning I went into a trance and some entity gave me the information. I wrote it down and say, you have to totally trust me. This is real because Xerxes of the Starseed Nebula gave this to me. There's a lot of that in esoteric traditions. And I struggle with most channeling because I'm not going to say it doesn't happen ever and it's zero, but you have to be very skeptical with this. So I am an esoteric, and I'm telling you to be skeptical, right? You always want to take things with a grain of salt. Now, I've also seen things myself through experience to know that there are things that we cannot explain. I was first, for those who haven't followed the channel, maybe this is your first time, I was brought into esotericism over 30 years ago. And as a boy, well, a teenager, I was brought into a Druid order. And after that, I left for the Army. And at the Army, I was stationed in Korea for my first year, so I was 18. And there was a mountain by the camp, and at the top of the mountain is a Buddhist temple. So they encourage us to, check it out. So I made that trek one weekend, and it was beautiful. And that opened me up to Eastern esotericism and Buddhism in general, because Buddhism is to me, a fantastic philosophy. There's a lot about Buddhism that I get along with. And it wasn't, as happenstance has it, downrange, which is what we call downtown. I was at one of the used bookstores, and I found one of, it was a book by Daniel Craig, I believe. But it dealt with Golden Dawn stuff, degree work and whatnot. And I got that, and I got pulled right into that. So from there, I got Israel Regardie's books and started working Qabalah. I was 19, 20 years old. So I've been doing that stuff for a while. I said, I've been doing Qabalah for almost 30 years, and I've been involved in esoteric traditions for over 30 years. And in that time, I have seen things that have confirmed that the world is not what it seems. Experiential trumps skepticism in my book. If I experience something and I sit down and dwell on it and meditate on it for a little bit and come to a conclusion, that's why I believe the things I believe. That's how people have those profound touches with God and come, to spirituality or religion. I am not religious. I don't subscribe to any religion. I don't subscribe to any rules telling me how to believe in God, which is what I believe religion to be. But I am spiritual, and I am on my mission and quest is reunification with the divine. And that took a dark night of the soul to pull me back onto my path, but here I am. So that's a little bit about me, and experiential, but be skeptical, especially with, so I'm going to show a map of all the esoteric traditions that I know of, and there's a lot of them, and some of them are more fantastical than others. So anyhow, let's start with the esoteric timeline of the world. I personally like to know where things sit in the timeline of the world, because we always talk about how something's ancient. That's super ancient. The Temple of Solomon was built sometime in BC, but when? When did Moses walk around? To me, those things are important. I like to put them into context of the entire timeline of the world. Now, some of the stuff we're going to talk about is trust me, bro. Because this is the esoteric timeline of the world. This is one of them. And this one derives from Pappas's work. Now we know that a flood occurred sometime in the history of the world that was catastrophic and affected pretty much every civilization in the world. We know that that was likely a thing. At least all of the civilizations seem to talk about it for some reason, and they have no contact with each other, so that seems very weird. And so I begin our timeline with the Younger Dryas. Now, it's important to note that there were actually two warming periods roughly 12,000 years ago that could have caused a flood. So up to about 20,000 BC, we were locked in the last ice age. So most of the world was locked in ice, or a good chunk of the world was locked in ice. And then it rapidly began to melt. And they call that meltwater pulse 1A. That happened before the Younger Dryas, and that dumped a lot of water into the oceans. That could have been the Great Flood. And then the Younger Dryas happened out of the blue. All of a sudden, the world just froze again. It got really cold again and locked everything in ice before that rapidly disintegrated, and meltwater pulse 1B around 9700 BC dumped more water into the ocean. Okay, so a lot of water got dumped into the ocean. A lot of the coastlines were lost. And here's the thing with lost civilizations. A lot of those places would have been on the shores. Plato writes about Atlantis. Atlantis is a part of esoteric tradition, so you're going to hear about it a lot, whether you believe it or not. Now, there is no actual proof for Atlantis. This is true. But there's also things to consider. Number one, we have explored very little of the Sahara Desert. The Sahara Desert back at this point was very green and fertile. But we have done very little, if any, excavations or searching in the Sahara Desert because it's dangerous and expensive and doesn't give people anything other than scientific knowledge, which is not very important to us for some reason. So we don't know what's there. Number two, we've explored very little of underneath the ocean, where Atlantis allegedly sank. Now, Randall Carlson, who is a prolific, what is the word I'm looking for? He's not a PhD in geology, but he's a geologist. He's a brother in Freemasonry. He's a brilliant man. He talks about where he thinks the Atlantis is in the Azores area, the underground mountain range near Europe and Africa. And he claims that there's proof that there is evidence that the mountains sank around that time, and that there are fossilized remnants of plant life that couldn't have existed underwater. It had to have been above the water at that time, about 10,000 years ago or whatever. Is that proof of Atlantis? No. But there seems to be very little exploration over there. Then there's things like the Bimini Wall off the coast of Bimini, 20 feet underwater. It looks like a road. When you look at pictures of the dive site, science tries to tell us that's a natural configuration, but that looks it's very right angles. It's very right angles, and nature doesn't usually create things in right angles. It looks like blocks laid down, and from people who have dove it, they say that when they dive it and you go under the blocks, you can see there are like stones or something created in there to keep it level. So all of these things are suspicious for nature just created that. And Bimini would have been up 300 or 400 feet above the surface of the ocean 12,000 years ago or something like that. So there were civilizations, and humans have been around for over 100,000 years. We know that. So why is it a wild stretch to think that there weren't civilizations up until 5,000 years ago or whatever, 7,000 years ago? Like, we were stupid until 7,000 years ago, and suddenly we discovered how to be civilized. Those things don't make sense. And then there's the pyramid theories, which Tesla allegedly found that they were power sources, which we use that technology in Wi-Fi today. So we know Tesla's ideas worked. You can't at least say, the pyramids, there were no bodies discovered there. There was no indications that they were tombs. And when the Egyptians of the period of which that they were allegedly building the Great Pyramids tried to build other pyramids, Those pyramids look like crap. So esoteric tradition says that they found those and they repurposed them. Yes, all that stuff's incidental, trust me, bro, right? But it just seems very strongly, those are strong arguments to at least consider. Now, we know about the Samaria. Samaria is to the world the beginning of our civilization. However, in the Ramayana, they talk about the Empire of Ram starting roughly 6700 BC. And in 5000 BC, the ancient empire of Egypt began, according to Pappus. Egypt was allegedly the last colony of Atlantis. So when the flood happened and the Atlanteans dispersed, they went to several places. You'll find pyramid structures throughout the world. There's some under the waves of Japan with hieroglyphs for reasons. Again, this is very strange. These same proportions can be found in South America and Central America. But Egypt was the last supposed colony of the Atlanteans. And then in 4500, we have Samaria was founded. And then in 4000 BC, the city of Uruk was founded. Now, this is science. This is scholarly accepted. In 3228, the Empire of Ram ended. And roughly 2700 BC, the Shepherd Kings arrive in Egypt. Scholars state, and every time I find disputes, I like to note them for you. I'm not trying to say that these years are fact. I can tell you, you will find a lot of conflict on a lot of dates, even scholarly accepted dates. Scholars state that the Shepherd Kings arrived roughly 1630 to 1530 BC. Now, in 2700 BC, when the Shepherd Kings arrived, that the Egyptians felt threatened enough to preserve their knowledge. What they call the red race is knowledge, and that's where the great mysteries in Egypt were allegedly born. Now, a note on the colored races. Esoteric tradition teaches us that there were 4 or 5, depending on the tradition, races of men that have existed. We are either the 4th or 5th race today, and there will be 2 or 3 more after us to form 7 total. And these races were assigned a color. The color has nothing to do, as far as I know, with the color of our skin. The names of these races were appropriated by a certain funny Austrian painter and have become demonized. But our current iteration of humans are the white race, not the white people race, the white race. The red race was the race before us, the Atlanteans. So when you see the great mysteries in Egypt alluding to preserving the red race's knowledge, they're saying the Atlanteans' knowledge was preserved by the Egyptians. It has nothing to do with the color of skin, because I know we live in a time and period where that seems to matter quite a bit. We see Zoroaster and Krishna appearing shortly thereafter. We see the Akkadians conquering Sumeria in 2334. We see that the Phoenician leader known as Bali, who was Nimrod, built Babel and founded Babylon in roughly 2300. We see the Shepherd Kings invading Egypt in 2200, but scholars again state that was 1630 to 1530. We see the Akkadian Empire collapsing in 2154, and the ancient Egyptian Empire ending with its 10th dynasty in 2064, and there were, I believe, 14 dynasties. So that's the end of the ancient line of the Egyptian kings, and there will be 4 more dynasties that would follow that. Now, why is that all important? These people, the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, the Babylonians, the Sumerians, the Empire of Ram, the Akkadians, etc., 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 all had a series of mythology and legends that shared from each other and changed some names around. But when the Hebrews got a hold of this, which we'll see, the Old Testament was written, which most of my audience here is going to recognize. These tales are oft inspired by those older legends, so it's important to know the major powers that came before the Israelites and the Bible, because those were the form of our modern civilization's idea of religion. That's why I have them included here. Now, Western esoteric tradition largely begins, Western Hermetic esotericism largely begins with Moses, roughly 1450 to 1406 when he died. 1450, he was at the apex of the things he was doing. Now, Moses was a high priest of Egypt, according to esoteric tradition. He was steeped in the ways of the Egyptian mysteries, the Atlantean mysteries. And he murdered an Egyptian, and this is in the Bible, and he fled. And while in the wilderness, he was taught the final mysteries of the Atlanteans regarding divine unity. And that while Moses was on Mount Sinai, he obtained several things. One of those was the Ten Commandments, which we know he, coming down and seeing the idol being created before him, he broke those and went back up the mountain. One of the other things that he brought down was the tradition that would become later to be known as the Qabalah. So this is where the Qabalah is said to begin, and why Western esotericism, Western Hermetic esotericism begins here, because this is where the Qabalah was transmitted to Moses. Now, Moses lived to be 120 years old according to the holy writings. Now, after Moses, a couple hundred years later, or about 400 years later, we get into the era of the Jewish temple. And the era of the Jewish temple is very important to Freemasons because our current myth revolves around the Temple of Solomon. Now, it's important also to note that this wasn't always the case when it comes to Freemasons. So, a little aside, before the public revelations of Freemasonry in 1717, there's very little to nothing written about King Solomon or Hiram Abiff legend in any of the rituals that they found or have seen. We know, I've read the Oath of Nimrod that was taken in the 14th century by stonemasons. And the more ancient rituals deal with Noah and his 3 sons. So the era of the Jewish temple is important to Freemasons as of the current, what is currently known as Freemasonry, which begins in 1717. And I wanted to point that distinction out. Now, the era of the Jewish temple, we know that the first temple was completed roughly 1004 BC. And we see a couple hundred years later, the Greek city-states emerge from the Mycenaean roots, and the Greek alphabet was created in 800. So that means the Temple of Solomon was erected before Greece was a thing. In 586 BC, the Chaldean king Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the Temple of Solomon. He burned and razed it to the ground. And the faithless Zedekiah, who was the last of Judah's kings, was made sightless and cast into a dungeon in Babylon. Now, interesting to note with all of this is that temple was destroyed in 586 BC. The Babylonian Empire would end 50 years later when Persia conquered it. It became part of the Persian Empire. And it was Cyrus that allowed the Jewish people to return to their homeland and begin rebuilding. But it wasn't until King Darius, 18 years later, that actual work was really able to be begun, and the holy vessels and whatnot were returned back to Jerusalem. And the second temple was completed, per Masonic legend anyway, in 516 BC. And scholarly academia is close enough in agreement. The years are like a couple years off, but whatever. 516 BC it was completed, and thus 70 years of captivity between the end of the first temple and the destruction of the second temple. And in that time, the Jews were exposed to Babylonian legend, and this is where the book of Genesis began to take root or be compiled, and what we would know as the Abrahamic faiths began to emerge, and our Western Christian, Jewish, and Islam foundations were being set. Now, after that, in 530 BC, so right before the second temple was completed, we see that Pythagoras erects his school in Croton. And Pythagoras is a very important figure in Western esotericism. In fact, for a while I considered him the beginning of the tradition, but it was actually Moses. But Pythagoras, most people don't know about Pythagoras other than in geometry. When you're in high school, you have to learn about that theorem, and that's it. Pythagoras is the one who set the stage for numerology and setting up the quality of numbers, many other things that later Plato, Aristotle, etc. would borrow from. So Pythagoras is a huge contributor to our tradition. And in 509 BC, the Roman Republic begins. So this sets that timeline. Rome hadn't even begun yet when the second temple was erected. Now, this is just a short list, but continuing on, we see the Roman Republic founded. We see Plato establishing his academy in Athens in 387 BCE, which had the famous line above its entrance, "Let no one who is not a geometer enter." And from Plato, we get works like the Timaeus and the Republic. And Timaeus, of course, again, is a springboard for Gnosticism. And for any who would study Gnosticism, it would do you well to crack open the Timaeus and go through that. Alexander the Great conquers Egypt in 332. Jerusalem gets conquered and sacked, well, several times, unfortunately. The Book of Enoch is written in 100 BC. Pompey conquers Jerusalem. Herod is made governor. The Roman Republic becomes the Roman Empire in 27 BC when Augustus is crowned as emperor. And Christ is born, allegedly, in the year 7 BCE. Now, that's a very specific number. I used to ask that question when someone would tell me that. Because people go, no, he was born in 0. That's what switches the timeline. But then other people say, no, it was 7 BCE. Where that 7 comes from, because that's a very specific number, we don't have records on when he was actually born. In that year, astronomically, you can determine that Jupiter and Saturn were in a grand conjunction in the constellation of Pisces. So this is what astrologers refer to as the beginning of the age of Pisces, and thus had to be the birth of Jesus Christ, because Jesus Christ's birth ushered in the age of Pisces. Astrology at this point was a science, and it had come from the Babylonians and Chaldeans, and the Greeks had improved on it, Hellenistic astrology. Now from this, John the Baptist would be beheaded at roughly 32 to 36 of the Common Era, and Christ would be crucified in 33 to 37 of the Common Era, which of course throws into question of how old he really was, because people say he was only 33 years old. No one knows. People will argue forever on that. So I honestly don't know that it's important that he be 33 or 38 or however old he was when he was crucified, but some people will die on that hill. We know from Josephus that Pontius Pilate was the governor from 26 to 37 of the Common Era, so it had to have been between those two things. And the most important, and not the most important, but the last event of the Common Era was in the year 70. The Second Temple of Solomon was destroyed by the Romans and never rebuilt, and that ends the era of the Jewish temple, which takes us into the Apostolic or Gnostic era. Now, at this point, Christianity was fighting itself. There were many sects of Christianity at this point. Many sects of Christianity, and they shared ties in some ways and differed grossly in others. So there was the Orthodox trying to form the principles of what we know today of as Christianity. They were formed off of the basis of what Paul wanted, which was supernatural Jesus. And he would fight Jesus' brother James and actually throw James down the steps of the temple. And instead of being stoned to death like he should have been, he was escorted out of the city by a Roman company of soldiers. So, which leads us to believe that St. Paul was actually a Roman citizen and working for the government in ways, because no normal citizen would have had a military escort to escape that. He would have been stoned to death by Jewish law. There were the Marcionites, the Sethians, the Valentinians. You hear about Simon the Magus, the evil Simon the Magus. And all of this would come to a head in the 300s. So Emperor Constantine had a problem on his hands. The Roman Empire at that time was very divided. Its people hated each other. There were divides everywhere, kind of like today. I know, shocking. And so Constantine was a pagan. And scholars will disagree with this, but other scholars will agree with this. So again, this comes back to trust me, bro. Depends on the source you're reading. But Constantine was, I'm going to say, to me that's a fact, even though it's disputed. He was a pagan. He worshipped Mithras, the sun god. And a lot of those influences can be seen in Christianity today. And that's just a fact. But he used Christianity as a tool to cement the empire back together again. And so the Council of Nicaea was created in 325 of the Common Era. And at that council, they decided to go through all of the works of the Bible, or what would be the Bible, and anything that they liked, they kept, and anything that may cause division, that was heresy. And there was a lot of heresy. As legend has it, there was a whole company of soldiers stationed outside of the council, and the room itself was lined with Roman soldiers to remind all of the priests voting that all the eyes of the fraternity were upon them. And so when the emperor would say, it seems like a good idea that this should be removed from Scripture, right, guys? They looked around and saw all those soldiers in the room. They're like, yep, sounds good to me. We don't want to die. But it was at that council that it was made clear this is the real Bible, and this is fiction, heresy, and evil. And anyone caught with this will be burned along with the material. In the year 391, the Library of Alexandria was destroyed by a Christian mob. In the year 392, Emperor Theodosius declared that all pagan worship would be a crime, and he ordered all temples to be closed, all of its writings and artifacts were to be brought out and burned, and anyone caught with them would be burned along with them. There was a lot of pillaging, destruction, and murder during this time. This was a very dark and evil time. In the year 396 of the Common Era, the Eleusinian mysteries in Greece were destroyed by the Visigoths. And thus, shortly thereafter, the Roman Empire collapsed and Western Europe entered a dark age. Now, while Western Europe enters the dark age, the Middle East and the East, they enter a great time. All those Hermeticists, Neoplatonics, and Gnostics fled to Baghdad and a city called Haran and other places, and there flourished. Mathematics and science flourished. The Sabians of Haran were formed, and the Middle East became the center of civilization, while Western Europe languished in its dark age. Now, that wouldn't last forever. Islam would come into power, and at first, for its first beginnings, it was very accommodating to all of the people of the Bible. In fact, it is said that the Christians under Islamic rule flourished more under the Islamic rule than they did under Christian rule. And then the Crusades started happening. Now, at this point, the West has lost all access to its mysteries. So now we get into, the Knights Templar. Now, the Knights Templar. There's a lot of debate on this, guys. Scholars state that the Knights Templar were formed in the year 1118 or 1119, I've seen both, and that they were simply a Catholic knightly order sent to guard pilgrims from bandits and whatnot and fight in the Crusades, and then were falsely accused of heresy and brutally killed and put to death. Brutally killed and put to death. Well, yeah. Brutally killed and exterminated, erased. They were forgiven by the church during the time that they were going through that, but that was kept on the down low. That's what scholars say, because that's what's written down in history. Most of what we know about the origins of the Knights Templar come from a writing or a book that happened, or that was written in the 1180s or thereabouts, which was about 70 years after they were founded. So that's like talking today, if it's 2025, that's like reading a book about an order founded in 1955, and we're reading a book that just came out today about that order. There's a lot of distance between those two things. Okay, so that's what scholars will tell you. And we're going to get into some of the debate here. Now, the Knights Templar, esoterically, there are a few stories, but esoterically, in the tradition that I follow, the tradition I am a part of, I am the current sitting prior of the Knights Templar Collegiate here in my city. So we study this and we practice this form of esotericism. And in our tradition, and there are over 100 traditions of Knight Templars, from what I've gathered from my own research, but in mine, we say that they were founded in roughly 1086, and that year is fuzzy, but it was founded in Constantinople under Hugh de Pons or Hugh de Paynes, and they were given strict charge. They were initiated into the Brotherhood of the East, and they were given strict charge to go to the Holy Lands and recover sacred artifacts, under the front of guarding pilgrims along the roads. Now, let it be known at this time that these were middle-aged knights, roughly my age, and there were 9 of them. My friends, 9 middle-aged knights are not guarding the roads against bandits. They were from Gnostic families. This will be scholarly debated, hotly debated, because there's no proof. There's no written proof of this. But according to our tradition, the core of the Knights Templar were Gnostic. Now, the Gnostics, they were smart, because Gnosticism was a death sentence. They practiced whatever the prevailing religion was in their area. So they practiced Catholicism for these guys in France. And off they went to Jerusalem, and they were just magically granted access to the Temple of Solomon by King Baudouin. He said, "Yeah, you can hang out there, no problem." Again, that shouldn't have happened if they didn't have a mission and the king didn't know about it. They wouldn't have just been granted permission to go hang out in the ruins of the temple, but they did. They made their headquarters in the stables of the temple and began to dig and recover artifacts from under the temple. We know that to be true because they have found the tunnels with Templar artifacts in them. One of the relics that they found, and the exact list is not known exoterically, but one of the items that they found was the head of John the Baptist, as he was beheaded in an ossuary. And they found some bones of other people that shouldn't have been found in an ossuary. That caused the church to have a small panic. But that bearded head, that head they allegedly kept, is likely the small bearded head called the Baphomet that they were accused of worshiping. Now, they did venerate John the Baptist. John the Baptist, the veneration comes from a tradition known as the Johannites, and the Johannites are said to have inducted or been a part of the Templar creation. They passed that tradition on to Hugh de Pons and the Templars. Now, Baphomet, if you write Baphomet out in Hebrew and you apply the Atbash cipher to it, comes out to be Sophia. And Sophia was the Gnostic goddess of wisdom, which was a no-no. Obviously, it's a no-no to be worshiping Sophia or revering Sophia. They didn't even like it when you revered Mary, and Mary is Sophia's counterpart, basically. But that's the head, right? The head. We know that the last major Gnostic sect were the Cathars in France. They were completely wiped out and murdered by the church in the 1200s in a holy crusade. And the Templars were conspicuously absent from those operations. And on Friday, October 13, 1307, they were betrayed by the King of France and exoterically ended by papal decree in 1312. And Jacques de Molay, the last exoteric known Grand Master of the Templars, was put to death in March of 1314. Now, if you've been on my channel, you've heard me talk about this in depth. What happened to the Knights Templar afterwards? They are said to have fled underground. They fled all over the world. Some of them returned to Portugal, which we know to be a fact. Some of them went to the Byzantine Empire. Some of them became privateers. Some of them went to Scotland, where they served under Robert the Bruce and fought against England. Now, some of the other fun theories. They hid in plain sight amongst their stonemasons. It is said that the Knights Templar had a hand in creating the Rosicrucian and Freemasons, and that they received the the mysteries, that they from their dealings with the Sufis and the other people of the East, that they were able to retrieve those mysteries and bring them back west. So those 2 points are hotly contended by any academic, because there's no written evidence, number one, and there never will be. I don't think you'll ever they did not write, we went over and got the Western mysteries today in 1214. You'll never see that. The 2 major points of contention, we'll start with bringing the mysteries back, is that most of the Knights Templar were illiterate. From what I've gathered, that's true. A lot of them during their Inquisition, when they were being interrogated, couldn't even sign their own name. They didn't know how to write. And when they raided their private chambers, very few books were found, indicating that they had no use for books because they couldn't read. Bearing in mind that the Templar Order was much more than just its knights. The knights only made a very small fraction of that up. And it's true, most knights and men-at-arms were illiterate back then. The Templars were stonemasons, the Templars were farmers, the Templars were craftsmen, the Templars were clergy, the Templars were scribes. There were literate members of the Templar Order. And it was to those that had received the mysteries and conveyed them via symbol. Second, those mysteries being conveyed, the Templar Order was, as I understand, a lot like an onion. It consisted of layers. And when people think of, the Knights Templar did this, they think that whole order was a part of it. Only the core of the Templars were the Gnostics and the mysteries, right? Everything around that were largely Catholics and just normal people serving the order. So not everyone was in on it. As far as the Freemasons are considered, no, the Knights obviously didn't establish the Freemasonic order, but those mysteries got funneled into the symbology of Freemasonry through the families related to the Templars. That is how they say that the Templars had a hand in the creation of Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism, by following the Gnostic tenets and the Hermetic tenets that these symbols connect to. Again, there's no proof of that. You're not going to find some guy writing, I, blah, 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 ancestor of this knight, created the Freemasonic order. That doesn't exist, nor will it exist. We know the first Freemasonic writing was 1380 or 1390. It's the Regius poem, which was 80 years after the Templars were suppressed. We know that the first statutes were the Shaw statutes in 1598 and 1599, which is said how to govern a lodge. We know that the first ritual was in the 1600s that we have access to. We know that it existed before that, but there were no writings that we can access. And writings also were destroyed. There was a lot destroyed in that period of time. So none of this can be academically proven. So keep that in mind. These are the ties that exist. There are things that are very coincidental between the two orders where you can say there's at least an indirect tie between them. They may not be directly responsible for, but they did have a hand in influencing. All right, so now that brings us, now that we understand the history of everything, we're getting there. We're almost to the end of the history of Western esotericism. What are the mysteries? When we say the mysteries, what do those mean? The mysteries are the teachings and philosophies of those that had come before us, that being the Atlanteans and other ancient civilizations. Egypt was the last bastion of the Atlanteans. It was the last colony. It was not the only colony, but it was the last one. And the definition of the mysteries is fluid. Of course it is. It changes its meaning. So Pappas talks about the lesser mysteries being things like what you would learn in school today, high school. Back then that would made you highly educated. Also the lesser mysteries, as they began to be taught in Greece, these were things involving mastering your emotions, learning about virtue, learning about your morals, honor, courage, training your mind via study, not being afraid to die for your convictions, and not being afraid of death. Those were all considered the lesser mysteries. And those have a very strong tie to certain orders today, like the Freemasons. The greater mysteries delve into the divine order, the cycle of life and death, and unifying ourselves with the divine. And this is where the connection between Hermeticism and the greater mysteries comes from. This is our tie to the Egyptian mysteries, which allegedly tie to the Atlantean mysteries. I'm using the word allegedly, right? I'm not trying to pretend that I know it to be so, but I believe it to be so. I'm not going to read this list, but this is a list of authors that I, in my life, have studied and explored. You can take a screenshot of this, kind of look into them. This is not an exhaustive list as well. There's a lot more than this, but these are the ones that stuck out in my mind. Some of this comes from my studies in the Martinist order, particularly Martinez de Pascali, who formed the Lewis Cohen Masonic priesthood, Louis Claude de Saint Martin, who was the basis upon which Papists created the Martinist order from, and their many, many contemporaries. My philosophy has always been follow the trail to the source, meaning if we are reading today books written today, you're listening to my voice today, I'm synthesizing information that was synthesized by someone who synthesized something, etc., over the decades and centuries. So I like to get to the source of where those people were coming from, and not just listen to what that person had to say, but where is he getting this from? Because a lot of people pass it off like it's their own knowledge. And we've obtained that knowledge from somewhere, and to me it's important to tell you where I got that knowledge from, so that you can also study and follow that path should you wish. Now, the last thing we're going to look at before we end part one is the history of Western esotericism from the Knights Templar. And this is going to be real brief. And all this is, and I got this slide somewhere online. I saw someone had put this work together, and I emulated it in PowerPoint. So this is not my original work, but this was a beautiful thing. And it kind of graphically puts it together in a way that you can see all of, when I say esotericism is many things, this is showing you esotericism is many things. So here's Freemasonry. Being Freemasonic order is a form of esotericism. And you can see from Freemasonry, they say, stems from the Templar tradition and is cousins to the Rosicrucian tradition. You can see from Freemasonry, we get the Mormon Church, we get the Lewis Cohen's priesthood, which turns later synthesized into the Martinist order. If you become a part of the Martinist order, there are several versions of the Martinist order you can join. You will study some of this. It gets pretty deep. There's a lot to go into, but it's fascinating. You can see from Rosicrucianism, we drop down into the Order of the Golden and Rosy Cross, which turns into the SRIA. The SRA for you Masons is the Rosicrucian, the Freemasonic Rosicrucian College. North America has its own version, which is invite only. It's very difficult to get into. But for esoteric Masons, is, as I understand it, where you want to be. And from there, we have the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which I'm very familiar with in my life. But you can see from this stems Theosophy and a bunch of other spiritualism, New Thought, etc. And into the 20th century, we get the new wave of the spiritual enlightenment, which came from the mid to late 1800s all the way through the 20th century. We can see that Crowley comes along and invents Thelema. He overtakes the OTO and the AA. And Gerald Gardner, who's a friend of Crowley, creates Wicca. We have Anton LaVey and his fun little church that is created. We have the unfortunate Thule Society. I don't whitewash, guys. I don't whitewash history. I pretend they don't exist. So those things are on this slide, just so you're aware that not everything esoteric is good. There are things we call the left-hand path, and they flourish in this world as well. Be aware that they exist and be very careful of them. The Thule Society is what stemmed the funny Austrian man with the mustache and his little order. Neo-paganism, we saw the explosion of the Celtic, Viking, and Greek worship, the pagan worship. The Druids came back in the 20th century, and we have the goddess movement. And then you have over on the right the other things like the Church of Scientology, the New Age movement, and the UFO religions, the starseed religions. All of those are considered esoteric and are part of the entire umbrella of esotericism. So you could see Western Hermetic esotericism is a tiny sliver of all of those things. And not all of those things have anything to do with the other. And in conclusion, the three pillars of Hermetic Western esotericism are the Qabalah, alchemy, and Gnosticism. And in the next video, we are going to be discussing Qabalah and where that fits into, and how Hermetic Western esotericism uses that to achieve our goal, or to help us achieve our goal of reuniting with the divine. So that was a lot of stuff. This lecture right here is longer than my entire lecture in Lodge, so you got to experience a lot of different things. You probably sped me up if you could. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. Otherwise, I look forward to doing part 2 for you, and we'll talk about the Qabalah. And we'll see you then. So take care.